resulting from the derailment. However, the ultimate costs may exceed the immediate cleanup needs. And moreover, an apparent lack of transparency on the part of Norfolk Southern, at least in the early days of the response, has left some members of the community battling with mistrust and looking for answers. We're told that the company's failure to communicate directly includes information given to some first responders who were under the impression that only one car would be vented and burned rather than 5. This miscommunication left first responders scrambling to ensure the public safety requirements of a much, much larger plume. We've also heard from some residents who were told it was safe to return to their homes, but are still experiencing ongoing health problems. Other concerns remain, such as loss of property values and the long-term impacts on the most vulnerable citizens, including children and the elderly. As I said earlier, today presents us with the opportunity to learn from this experience, address misinformation, and gain a better understanding of the long-term plan to protect public health and address the environmental impacts of this disaster. Just as we witnessed an earlier environmental disaster in Ohio 54 years ago that I've alluded to, a new generation of Americans is now waiting to see how their government responds today and in the days to come. This incident may well prove to be a defining moment in their lives as it was in my own. Let's do what's right, not only for the people of East Palestine, but for everyone who believes that those who transport potentially dangerous chemicals must take the necessary steps to protect our people and our one and only planet. And with that, let me turn over the rest of the opening statements here to my ranking member and my partner in so many ways, Senator Capito. Senator Capito.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here today. And I'm really pleased that we have the hearing and we have our fellow senators here with us as well. As you said, we're going to discuss the ongoing environmental response to a large-scale chemical spill resulting from a Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, which is 14 miles north of the West Virginia border. Before we go any further, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the emergency responders who were on the scene and less than an hour after the incident was reported and are continuing today to work diligently on our cleanup efforts. Thank you all so much. These kinds of accidents are some of the toughest days for them because these men and women, these are their neighbors. These, in some cases, they're relatives and certainly their hometown friends. So it weighs on all of us here. This catastrophe upended the lives of thousands of our constituents in states represented today. The residents of East Palestine and other impacted communities, including those in West Virginia, deserve the chance to hear publicly from those involved in and affected by the cleanup efforts. They need to know what progress has been made, the challenges that lay ahead, and what lessons can be learned to improve future responses. From day one, responders across all levels of government, as well as the private sector, have worked around the clock on monitoring and mitigation to keep the public and environment safe. I appreciate EPA and other relevant organizations for providing regular updates to Congress on the status of the response. However, I want to convey to all of you that the public deserved a better level of transparency and much, much sooner. A month after the accident, it's clear to me that EPA's risk communication strategy fell short. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, impacted communities were clamoring for answers. While we're well aware that monitoring efforts and response planning need to be sound, we need to understand why it took so long for the EPA to get accurate data to the public. This is especially true when organizations like the Ohio EPA and the Ohio River Valley Sanitation Commission, better known as ORSENCO, both represented on our panel today, managed to provide data and safety information to the public quicker. That even includes they were distributing EPA data faster than the agency itself was willing to, not only with the public, but also during briefings and conversations with the affected congressional offices. In the absence of adequate transparency to the public, that just opens up a gap for social media, armchair citizen scientists, and political pundits on both sides to fuel false narratives that have further undermined that public confidence in the response to the derailment. With each week passing, the confusion seemed to grow. Even after weeks of repeated air, soil, and water monitoring have shown levels of the implicated contaminants of magnitude well below the ATSDR and EPA levels of concern in the air and water, the initial delays in messaging and response has meant that the residents still do not trust these results enough to feel safe. And trust is essential in these situations. That has been made worse, I think, by a lot of the misinformation that we've seen. You can't address fear and mistrust by pointing residents to an EPA website filled with fact sheets and press releases. Risk communications needs to be done in a clear but compassionate, relatable manner right down there where it's happening. So why did it take weeks for the EPA administrator to drink the water he repeatedly told residents was safe? Why did it take almost a month to establish a response center and go door to door to East Palestine families' concerns? As a result of early missteps, I believe that we need to keep moving forward here. This committee must get to the bottom of whether EPA has some of the authorities for some of the actions that it's taken on the removal and whether they are serving the best interests of our constituents. So how will EPA approving every shovelful of dirt that is moved benefit safety or expedite the process? These are the questions I'm going to have. How and why is EPA prohibiting contaminated soil and water from leaving the state of Ohio for into qualified destruction facilities? How's that going to improve outcomes? I'm concerned that at least one of the Ohio facilities EPA is now activating for this purpose has a history of Clean Air Act violations and may not be able to sufficiently destroy contaminated soils in a way that assures communities may not be further impacted by emissions resulting from incomplete incineration. So, the EPA has been slow to respond to some of our office's inquiries on the use of PFAS firefighting foams in combating the fire, nor explaining how residues from those foams may be responsible for some of the purported pollution that has made the rounds. The EPA could have also made abundantly clear that Norfolk Southern would be completely liable and that no expense would be spared in the cleanup efforts. That's required by the law. Instead, it took weeks for the average American not well-versed in the nuances of CERCLA, which is the act that covers this, to receive that assurance. Mr. Shaw from Norfolk Southern will be on our panel, and I look forward to hearing from you on what Norfolk Southern is doing to make things right. But as you know, and as you've stated in your statement, your company will pay for the harm that it has caused and is paying. It will pay for the initial cleanup and likely pay again when the lawsuits from the myriad harms caused begin to come in, though how much will be a matter for the courts. Culpability in this incident and the liabilities that will result are clearly defined in the statutes known as CERCLA, and the liabilities for Norfolk Southern under CERCLA are among the broadest and strictest in any federal law. Before Congress considers any changes to existing laws, we must better understand what has gone wrong with this response so far and what can be done better in the future, but also what went right. So, to the residents of East Palestine and surrounding communities, your Congress hears you. Every American deserves to feel safe in their home and confident that the water that they drink and that the air that they breathe is safe. When something like this happens, God forbid, they should also be able to trust the federal government will be quick, deliberate, transparent, and clear in their response, and that guilty parties will be held responsible. I believe the environmental laws on the book are up to the task. So what has gone wrong? What has gone right? That's what we're here to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now recognize Senator Jeff Merkley. Jeff is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Chemical Safety, Waste Management, Environmental Justice, and Regulatory Oversight. We'll recognize him for his statement. Jeff, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, for today's hearing. As chair of the Chemical Safety Subcommittee, it's absolutely critical we examine the impacts to public health and well-being of the people of East Palestine following this disastrous derailment of a Norfolk Southern freight train that was carrying tons of toxic and hazardous materials and certainly the impact coming from the plumes of smoke that burned for over 2 days. This tragedy demands accountability because future derailments will happen. Unless we learn the lessons of this incident, there will undoubtedly be more derailments with devastating impacts on additional communities. For years, my office has been hearing from Oregonians who are terrified about the risks of trains rolling down the tracks in the middle of their towns full of toxic chemicals. They remember when a Union Pacific train derailed in Mosier, Oregon in June 2016, spilling some 42,000 gallons of crude oil in front of a school, a massive fire, damage to the water and sewer systems, and the debris made their way into the Columbia River. And they remember the billowing tower of toxic black smoke that could be seen for miles and miles up and down the Columbia Gorge in an area blanketed in toxic ash. At that time, Senator Wyden and I pushed for huge improvements in track maintenance, improvements in the brakes, improvements in the tank cars, improvements in the pre-positioning of supplies to respond to disasters, and improvements in communications. But the progress was very limited. Since 2015, there have been 100 derailments of trains carrying hazardous materials, 1 per month. In this coming year, there'll probably be another 12 at this pace. As of 2017, around 1 million tons of hazardous materials is transported by rail every day. And that was the last year the numbers were released, and I suspect they're even higher today because we have growing supplies of toxic chemicals, particularly related to the plastics industry. We know the danger posed by these chemicals. We know that when they're going down the rails, there's the possibility of a disaster, but there's so much that can be done to limit the odds of disasters happening, and that's our responsibility. We need to recognize that when a derailment occurs and toxic chemicals like vinyl chloride are leaked, people are aware that these chemicals cause lymphoma and leukemia and cancers. And so they're absolutely, legitimately, extremely concerned, and many residents of East Palestine are complaining about all sorts of health issues. So let's have this hearing today be an opportunity for us to examine not just the response, but how to prevent these derailments in the future, the type of investments that are required so that future communities are not terrorized by these derailments that are happening at a pace of once per month. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Capito, for the opportunity to share those comments.
Senator Markley, thank you so much. Now I'm going to recognize Senator Mullen, the subcommittee ranking member, for his statement. Senator Mullen, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off by thanking everyone, including our 5 panelists, and Senator Brown, Senator Vance, and Senator Casey, for attending this hearing. The people of East Palestine have shown perseverance and bravery during the time that's understandably they're very anxious and upset about. In the aftermath of the derailment, the decision was made to burn hazardous chemicals leaking from rail cars out of fear of explosion. Since then, residents have reported headaches, coughing, fatigue, irritation, pain, burning sensations on their skin. People of East Palestine now fear their health, despite the EPA claiming that everything's okay. The public's trust in the government is near record low. Only 20% say that they trust the government to do the right thing. After the last 3 years, there's no wonder that the residents are calling into question about the response and advice the government bureaucrats is giving. The mixed messaging from the administration in the days and weeks after the tragedy has only added the fuel to the fire. Actions have consequences. Both the Secretary of Transportation and the Administrator of the EPA delayed their visit to East Palestine, says that when they got there, hey, it wasn't our problem. It was the previous administration and their deregulation that caused this. It's time for everyone to take responsibility. In contrast, I applaud the timely on-ground response efforts from the local residents and the first responders. The people of Ohio have truly come together to help neighbors in the time of need. In Oklahoma, we call that the Oklahoma Standard. Moving forward, today's hearing allows us and allows witnesses to provide much-needed clarity and assurance to the public. We need to know how to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. We need to know what caused it. There are serious questions that need to be addressed, such as the states that toxic waste is being shipped to, how long the chemicals were setting in the cars, if the bearings were appropriately re-inspected, why were all 5 cars burned instead of just the one, why the administration and Norfolk failed to provide accurate and timely information to local authorities, and finally, what are we going to do about the town moving forward? The residents understandably do not feel safe, and we need a plan to put their lives back together. I expect our witnesses to transparently discuss these issues so we can prevent accidents like this from occurring in the future. Leaders take responsibilities. They don't point fingers and dodge responsibilities. The people of East Palestine need to see the administration and Norfolk take responsibility and show results. I yield back.
Thanks very much for that comment. Before we turn to our colleagues who joined us for today, I want to just ask unanimous consent, if I could, to submit for the record a statement on behalf of our EPW colleague, Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who cannot be with us here today. For my colleagues, I'd just like to quote a couple of lines from Senator Fetterman's testimony, and here's what he says. He said, "I'm working with my colleagues across both state and party lines to fight for the forgotten people of Pennsylvania and Ohio, hold Norfolk Southern responsible for the damage that they've caused, and prevent similar disasters from happening in the future. I'd specifically like to thank my colleagues from Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator J.D. Vance, for being great partners with Senator Bob Casey and myself throughout this process." Senator Fetterman later states in his testimony, and I quote, "My hope is that we answer this disaster caused by egregious negligence from Norfolk Southern with real policy solutions that will hold Norfolk Southern and other similar companies accountable while making American families safer in the future. I believe that the legislation introduced last week is a great step. And I look forward to getting some answers today and continue to work with my colleagues to get Pennsylvanians and Ohio's alike the resources that they need." And that's cool. That's his statement. We thank him for it. We now turn to our colleagues who joined us here today. First, I want to recognize Senator Bob Casey. Senator Casey from Pennsylvania, you're welcome to proceed when you are ready. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee for holding today's hearing. I'm grateful to provide some testimony. I'm also grateful that I'm running ahead of both of my colleagues, Senator Brown and Senator Vance, because of my chairmanship of the Aging Committee, which is we're starting a hearing rather soon, so I appreciate their indulgence. I do want to thank both Senator Brown, Senator Vance, and Senator Fetterman for working with us and others on this bill. Representative DeLuzio of Pennsylvania as well has worked on this in the House, I know, with others. And wanted to start from the Pennsylvania side of this. Darlington Township, Pennsylvania, Beaver County, right on the Ohio border. As many of you know, the derailment occurred just literally feet away from the Pennsylvania border. And I know you'll hear today from Eric Brewer, who's the Director of Emergency Services and Chief of Hazardous Materials Response from Beaver County, and I'm grateful for his testimony. I'll just quote maybe three people. That's all I'll do in the interest of brevity. The first is Police Officer Dan Frederick about his experiences on the ground that night, and I'm quoting him. As a first responder, particularly as a police officer, we all know and understand the risks that come with our line of work. However, we usually know or have an idea of when something or someone can kill us. When I left my two boys and wife to respond to the quote, hot zone, I was expecting to be informed of exactly what was on the train and the potential health hazards. To say I was scared the night of the derailment is an understatement, unquote. I've also heard from residents about their fear of long-term health impacts and the safety of their families and communities moving forward. Jenny Santana of Darlington Township said, and I quote, "I want to know it's safe to stay here. All the people deserve honest answers, and nobody's getting them. If it were your children and your children's lives in question, how far away would be safe? Please hold them accountable and make them help us," unquote. Farmers in the region, I've heard, and I know my colleagues have heard the same, are concerned as well. They want help from the Department of Agriculture. They want certainty that their crops and their livestock are safe and free from contamination, and that the food supply and their livelihoods are safe. Farmer and Darlington Township Chair Mike Carrion said, quote, we along with countless other local agricultural producers have years invested in telling our stories and developing relationships with our customers. The stories of working in harmony with nature to produce a superior product. This story was ripped to pieces on the day of the derailment. It's now our responsibility to do damage control for Norfolk Southern's negligence. while absorbing revenue loss of canceled orders. The economics of our industry is very emotionally driven. Emotions are now being driven by perception and lack of information. We need testing. We need factual information. We needed this yesterday, and we're still not seeing that response, unquote. So these residents are scared, particularly the potential exposure that could lead to health impacts for themselves and their families for years. And we do have a response, at least for the future. We have a lot of work to do in the near term, but the future has to be about passing the Railway Safety Act that Senator Brown, Senator Vance, Senator Fetterman, and I and others are leading. It's bipartisan. That never happens around here on big bills, or rarely, I should say. It'd be a good start by Norfolk Southern to tell us today, in addition to what more they're going to do for the people of Ohio and Pennsylvania, tell us today that they support the bill. That would help. If a major rail company said, we support these reforms and will help you pass this bill. So that's what I think the people of both states deserve. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for this time, and I'm grateful to be first in line. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much, Senator Casey. Next, we're going to hear from Senator Jared Brown from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman,
Jared Brown.
Mr. Chair, thank you, and Ranking Member Capito, thank you, and Senator Merkley and Senator Mullen, thank you all for your thoughtful reflections and comments. I want to recognize Ohioans this morning, Ann Vogel with the Ohio EPA, who has been on site many times, including, I believe, every time I've been there, and the residents of East Palestine who made the trip, mothers who talked about what this means to their family. They represent Ohioans in this tight-knit town in Columbiana County, which once made 80% of the ceramics in this country, tableware. They produced 80% for the whole country in this community. They've seen their jobs move overseas where companies pay workers less. That's been the story of far too many places in our states. It's the kind of community that's so often forgotten or exploited by corporate America. Now these Ohioans are worried about whether their water is safe to drink, the air is safe to breathe, whether their kids will get sick, whether their crops are contaminated, whether they'll still be able to do business and attract investment to the community. Like Senator Vance, in my visits to East Palestine, I've talked with residents, Mayor Conway, Fire Chief Drabick, business owners, parents. I've heard their fears for what this means for their town and fears for the future. All because a big corporation, Norfolk Southern, chose to invest much of its massive profits in making its executives and shareholders wealthy at the expense of Ohio communities along its rail tracks. East Palestine, Steubenville, Sandusky, and just a week ago, Springfield. The company followed the Wall Street business model. Boost profits by cutting costs at all costs. The consequences for places like East Palestine be damned. In 10 years, Norfolk Southern eliminated 38% of its workforce. Think of that. In a decade, they cut more than a third of their jobs. We've seen what the company did with their massive profits. Norfolk Southern spent $3.4 billion on stock buybacks last year, and we're planning to do even more this year. That's money that could have gone to hiring inspectors, to putting more hot box detectors along its rail lines, to having more workers available to repair cars and repair tracks. Norfolk Southern's profits have gone up and up and up, and look what happened. The NTSB is conducting a special investigation in Norfolk Southern and its culture, investigating 5 significant accidents since December of 2021, including 3 accidents that resulted in the death of a Norfolk Southern employee. If Norfolk Southern had paid a little more attention to safety and a little less attention to its profits, it cared a little more about the Ohioans along its tracks and a little less about its executives and shareholders, these accidents would not have been as bad or maybe not happened at all. Just this week in Cleveland, a Norfolk Southern conductor and BLT union member was killed on the job. Lewis Schuster was the proud father of a 16-year-old son. It's Norfolk Southern's responsibility to keep its workers safe on the job, but this company has failed to do its job over and over and over. When I talk with Ohioans about what they want to see from this company in response to the disaster in East Palestine, I hear two things. First, Norfolk Southern must pay the money for every cent of the cleanup, as you've all said. Every water test, every hotel room, every bottle of water, every hospital bill. If an Ohioan comes down sick, Ohioan is sick because of the contaminants, next week, next year, for the next several years. We know this company can afford it. My colleague, Senator Vance, and I, and our Ohio delegation members of both parties have come together to make these demands of Norfolk Southern. Today, Ohioans expect to hear a firm commitment from this company's CEO that it will pay whatever it costs for as long as it takes to make this community whole. Second, Ohioans want assurances, as I think you all do, that this will not happen again. They have every right to be scared. On Saturday evening, just a month after the company's disaster in East Palestine, another Norfolk Southern train derailed in Springfield, Ohio. This time, the cars that derailed weren't carrying hazardous chemicals, but other cars on that 200-plus car train were. The only thing that saved Ohioans from another disaster was luck, but we need more than that. That's why Senator Vance and I have come together to introduce our Bipartisan Railway Safety Act to make trains safer as they go through community after community. It shouldn't take a train derailment for elected officials to put partisanship aside and work together for the people whom we serve, not corporations like Norfolk Southern. Lobbyists for the rail companies have spent years fighting every effort to strengthen rules to make our trains and our rail lines safer. Now Ohioans are paying the price. If this company is serious in its commitment to preventing more East Palestinians in Ohio and across the country, I hope today that Mr. Shaw, as Senator Casey said so emphatically, I hope today Mr. Shaw will endorse our common sense bipartisan plan. Senator Vance and I come from different parties, different philosophies, but on this, we've come together for the people of our state, and I appreciate his work on this. The response to this crisis has been far too partisan, as Senator Mullen said. Today is an opportunity to change that. Senator Vance and I are listening to the same Ohioans in this community. We both made numerous trips there, people who feel like they have no way to stand up to a company like Norfolk Southern and are worried about what will happen when the cameras pack up and leave that Columbiana County community. These communities have been abandoned too many times before. My job, our job, is to hear their voice and to demand corporate accountability to bring this town back to the vibrant community we know that it can be again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Brown. And lastly, we want to recognize Senator J. D. Vance. Senator Vance, you may begin.
Great, thank you. So I want to start by acknowledging the people of East Palestine and Ann at the Ohio EPA who's done a great job on this tragedy, and just say that I think that our leadership, our media, and our politicians were slow to respond to this crisis, in part because a certain segment of our leadership feels like the people of East Palestine are a little out of style. They have the wrong politics, they're a little too rural, maybe a little too white. And I want to thank Senator Capito and Senator Carper, the chairman and ranking member, and all of you for paying attention to this, for caring about this issue, and for showing leadership on it. I think the most important message to the people of East Palestine is that we will not forget about them in the months and years to come. And I think this committee hearing reinforces that message. So it's very personally meaningful for me to be here. I want to also talk about something that hasn't gotten enough attention, but I think is an important part of what's going on the ground right now in East Palestine, which is the cleanup of the toxic chemicals that are in the ground, and they're still in the ground. Now, 2 weeks ago, I would have told you, and I said very publicly, that I was frustrated with Norfolk Southern from Allen Shaw on down for the refusal to dig up the railroad tracks and dig out the toxic chemicals, which is their responsibility to do. I am happy to report that it appears that Norfolk Southern has finally started to do the cleanup in earnest, but now the EPA is making it harder to get the materials out of Ohio in the first place into properly licensed facilities. Right now, as we speak, there are piles of dirt accumulating in East Palestine, piles of dirt filled with toxic chemicals that haven't been moved out of the state in a week. What happens if it rains? What happens if the very toxic dirt that we just dug out of the ground begins to seep back into the ground, causing problems for the air and water for the residents of East Palestine? We need leadership. We need the EPA to get on the ground and aggressively get this stuff out of East Palestine into properly licensed facilities. It's maybe the most important and most pressing thing that's confronting the community of East Palestine today. And again, I thank Ann for her leadership on that particular issue. After the cleanup, we're focused on the cleanup now, justifiably so, but after the cleanup, we need to turn to how to prevent this from happening, or at least how to make it less likely. I'm a realist. I recognize that you're always going to have accidents, but I think that we can make them less likely, and I think importantly, we can give our first responders proper notice when they're responding to these derailments when they happen. It is ridiculous that firefighters and local officials don't know that hazardous chemicals are in their community, coming through their community. In East Palestine, you had a community of largely volunteer firefighters responding to a terrible crisis, toxic burning chemicals without knowing what was on them. It's one of the things that the legislation that Senator Brown, Senator Casey, and Senator Fetterman and I have worked on together, and I thank them for their work on that issue. I want to talk I want to leave the committee with just a couple of additional thoughts here. I'm a Republican. I'm a pretty conservative Republican, and I worry that there has been a movement in my party and in my movement in response to the legislation that I proposed that would not hold Norfolk Southern or the rail industry accountable. I want to be explicit about that. Now, I'm not talking about returning, and this bill is not returning to the days of rate setting. The 1980s level airline and rail deregulation, I think in a lot of ways was good for consumers and good for the industry, but that doesn't mean we cannot have reasonable public safety enhancements in response to what happened in East Palestine. Now, I've talked to a number of my Republican colleagues, and nearly everybody has dealt in complete good faith, whether they like the bill or have some concerns about it, and these comments are not directed at them. Who they are directed at is a particular slice of people who seem to think that any public safety enhancements for the rail industry is somehow a violation of the free market. Well, if you look at this industry and what's happened in the last 30 years, that argument is a farce. This is an industry that enjoys special subsidies that almost no industry enjoys. This is an industry that enjoys special legal carve-outs that almost no industry enjoys. This is an industry that just 3 months ago had the federal government come in and save them from a labor dispute. It was effectively a bailout, and now they're claiming before the Senate and the House that our reasonable regulation, our reasonable legislation is somehow a violation of the free market. Well, pot, meet the kettle, because that doesn't make an ounce of sense. You cannot claim special government privileges. You cannot ask the government to bail you out and then resist basic public safety. Now, let me just say this. You've heard a lot of talk from my fellow Republicans, and I think that talk is very justified, that we are the party of working people in this country. There's been a big political realignment in this country over the last 30 years, a political realignment that, frankly, I benefited from. We are the party of firefighters, of police officers, of the people who go to work, pay their taxes, fight our country's wars, and keep our communities safe. We are proud of that, and we should be proud of that on the Republican Party. But now we are faced with a choice. With this legislation and how we respond to this crisis, do we do the bidding of a massive industry that is in bed with big government, or do we do the bidding of the people who elected us to the Senate and to the Congress in the first place? I believe that we are the party of working people, but it's time to be the party of working people. We have a choice. Are we for big business and big government, or are we for the people of East Palestine? It's a time for choosing. Let's make the right one.
Thank you very, very much, Senator Vance. Thank you, Senator Brown. My colleagues on this committee have heard me say more than a few times, bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And I'm encouraged that there's a bipartisan spirit that's afoot here, and I would urge you to continue to grow that, and we'll try to kindle support for it as well. With that having been said, we're going to recognize our next panel of witnesses. And I want to call the second panel of witnesses to come forward. And our first witness will be Mr. Shaw. In addition to Mr. Shaw, we will be hearing from Deborah Shore, the Regional Administrator for Region 5 of the Environmental Protection Agency. Well, good morning, one and all. I think I've had a chance to welcome you individually and personally. And we appreciate very much not only your presence here, but your willingness to share your thoughts and ideas with us as we try to make right a terrible wrong. We're going to turn to our first witness, and it's Alan Shaw. I appreciate the time you spent with me on the phone earlier this week. And Mr. Shaw, you may begin your testimony at this time. Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Alan Shaw, and I've been president and CEO of Norfolk Southern since May of 2022. I want to begin today by expressing how deeply sorry I am for the impact this derailment has had on the residents of East Palestine and the surrounding communities. I've been to East Palestine many times over the past month. I've talked with the leaders, the business owners, the school officials, the clergy, and others throughout the community. They've shared their stories and their concerns about the health of their families and the future of the community they love. I am determined to make this right. Norfolk Southern will clean the site safely, thoroughly, and with urgency. You have my personal commitment. Norfolk Southern will get the job done and help East Palestine thrive. At the direction of and in collaboration with the U.S. EPA, state and local agencies, we are developing and implementing near and longer-term cleanup activities. Air and water monitoring have been in place continuously since the accident, and to date, it consistently indicated that the air is safe to breathe and the water is safe to drink. In terms of community support, we have announced direct investments of over $21 million. We have provided support to more than 4,400 families through Norfolk Southern's Family Assistance Center. We established a $1 million fund available immediately to community leaders who will identify where donations can do the most good for East Palestine. We committed $7.5 million to Pennsylvania for a community relief fund, and we are reimbursing Pennsylvania emergency responders and health and environmental agencies for costs related to the derailment. All of this is just a down payment. We recently signed a lease for a more permanent space in East Palestine. I asked one of our frontline railroaders who lives in East Palestine to take on a new role as a full-time liaison, reporting directly to my office. He is advocating for the community in my office and overseeing distribution of another $1 million. We will be in the community for as long as it takes. To be clear, there are no strings attached to our assistance. If residents have a concern, we want them to come talk to us. Our website, nsmakingitright.com, provides the latest information and details on how to reach us. We have been cooperating fully with the NTSB's investigation into the cause of the derailment. The preliminary report found that the Norfolk Southern crew was operating the train below the speed limit and in an approved manner. Yet it is clear the safety mechanisms in place were not enough. As the NTSB continues its work, we are not waiting to act. Shortly after the derailment, I instructed my team to look at steps we could take to improve safety immediately. And we have announced a number of initiatives to do just that. These steps are just the start, and we look forward to working with policymakers and industry on others. We're also going to make our safety culture the best in the industry. The events of the last month are not who we are as a company. When I began my tenure as CEO 10 months ago, I spent hours in crew rooms all over our 22-state network, thanking our frontline railroaders and asking them for their advice. They are proud of the important work they do for the U.S. economy and take safety seriously. I'm going to make sure they've got the right training, the right processes, the right equipment, and the right technology. You have my commitment on that. Since becoming CEO, I have dedicated our company to charting a new course in the industry. I intend to continue working with industry stakeholders, including railcar owners, lessors, shippers, and other railroads, to make industry-wide safety improvements. It's going to take all of us, and Norfolk Southern is eager to lead that effort. Today, I'm proud to represent more than 19,700 Norfolk Southern employees who work every day to offer a safe and efficient means of transporting goods to businesses and families across our great country. When Norfolk Southern is successful, it is because our craft railroaders are getting the job done for our customers and the U.S. economy. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Shaw, thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you for that statement again, for the time you spent with me on the phone recently. Next, we're pleased to welcome Deborah Shore, Deb, the Regional Administrator for Region 5, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Shore, you're welcome to begin. Some things have been suggested that the EPA maybe hasn't done everything as well as they could have done, should have done. My sense is that EPA